Greetings, everybody. This is a quick tutorial on your immune response. So what we've already covered in class is the first and the second lines of defense, and we're now going to start activating cell-to-cell combat. So just a really quick review. So remember, your first lines of defense is all about preventing these pathogens from getting inside our body. Okay, so one of the examples we looked at was something like cholera. So this is a bacteria that it usually shows up in water and untreated water. And if I get it, I can have a series of different symptoms. A lot of these are going to involve my lower intestinal tract. So this is a particular pathogen that can survive my stomach pH. Okay, so this is pretty amazing that it can actually survive my stomach acid, and it does it because it's basically covered in a really strong protein coat. Similar organism to that is Salmonella. So Salmonella is a slightly different bacteria that again can survive my stomach process, and it goes after my lower intestinal tract. And both of these organisms can basically stop my body from absorbing water and essential nutrients. So cholera, I can basically die of water loss and dehydration through severe diarrhea. And salmonella is super important. I watch this because it actually can shut down my liver, and it can actually cause serious infection, especially with my kidney and potentially brain damage. So super important that these organisms, we really want to watch our water treatment as well as the food that we eat. Influenza is slightly different. This is one that gets in through my respiratory tract. And so this is a virus, so slightly different than a bacteria. But at the end of the day, all three of these organisms are a pathogen because they cause disease. So if they get through those first barriers, whether it's my stomach acid, or they get through the cilia or the hairs in my lungs, or the mucus coating in my nose, or through the mask that a lot of us are wearing right now, we need to start looking at our second line of defense. So the second line of defense is essentially where your body, this is now internal, and it's essentially the first thing it's going to try and do is it's going to try and cook out the pathogen. So the first thing it's going to do is you're going to spike a fever, and you're going to send extra fluid to these organisms or to these areas. So when you look at cholera and salmonella, this is basically where you might see an increase in bloating, and you get cramps because your stomach and your small intestines are sending more fluid to those areas. Okay, so you might find that your lower abdomen is getting really, really sore and tender. With influenza, this is going to be an increase in mucus. So your body is going to send extra reserves, and you're going to get a runny nose. You might even get a sore throat, and you're going to spike a local fever. Now, this is all happening to try and cook out these pathogens because they have a very low tolerance when things get a little bit warmer. Now, the next thing that's going to happen, and this is still the second line of defense, it's still kind of a general defense, you are going to get something called phagocytic leukocytes. Now, this is just a really fancy way of saying white blood cells that are going to eat these pathogens. Okay, so when we say phagocytic, so I'm going to try and teach you a few vocabulary words. So phagocytic basically means phago means to eat. Okay, and acidic is like a cell, cyto. This is basically an eating cell. This is what this does. This cell is going to eat other cells. So one of the things you can think of is if this is your white blood cell, okay, you have many different types. This white blood cell, if it comes in contact with one of these organisms, these pathogens, remember these pathogens are going to have a special antigen on their cell membranes. The white blood cells are going to read this antigen and say, you don't belong here. And it's going to seriously engulf it, and it literally eats it alive. And this is a really important thing that happens every single second of your day. So when this white blood cell eats this pathogen, it's going to do two things. One, it digests it, and so it can't spread anymore. But this is the most amazing thing that your immune system does. It will actually present the marker, the antigen from the organism onto its cell membrane. And this is super important because this is now its ability to talk to your specific cell defense. So this white blood cell, these phagocytic leukocytes, remember this is just a cell eating white blood cell, that's all this means, they now have an ability to relay information. And if they can't deal with your cholera or your salmonella or your influenza virus, by presenting these antigens on their outer shell, they can now call in the cavalry. And this is probably the most important thing that we do when we now go from your second line of defense to your third line of defense. Okay, so super important you understand what these white blood cells are doing, and they have a special name at this point. These are called monocytes. Okay, and they're probably one of the most important white blood cells in your body. They also have some friends called neutrophils or neutrophils. Now, your neutrophils are just general killers. They're just going to keep going and going and going. The monocytes, these are the really special ones because these are the ones that are going to present the antigen. And if the infection is big enough, they can actually change into what's called a macrophage. So macro just means bigger. Okay, so it's super important. And we're going to continue this on the next slide. So when we now have our third line of defense, when does this happen? So again, this is when our barriers have been breached, the fever didn't work, and our monocytes attempted to keep things in play, but things just are getting bigger and bigger. So again, just as a quick review, our neutrophils, again, these are our general killers. They're going to just stay in your blood, and they're going to read anything that shouldn't be there. So if you are this pathogen and you know you shouldn't be there, you're going to float around and you're in the blood, our neutrophils will find you. They're really, really great. But the problem is the neutrophil stays in the blood. The problem is when they now go outside of the blood cell. So again, the neutrophils can kind of follow and out. So if this is where it's in my skin or if it's in my intestinal lining, the neutrophils can still do their job. But again, once they eat one of these pathogens, then they kind of die. Monocytes are very, very good at killing over and over and over again. So here's what happens. This monocyte, it's going to consume this pathogen, okay? And when it does, it's going to present the antigen. And if it decides that the problem is too big and it needs help, it's going to send chemical messengers. Now, these chemical messengers are super important. Now, you might have heard this term before. These chemical messengers, this is called a cytostorm or a cytokine. Now, a cytokine storm is literally a series of chemical messengers looking for help. Now, this messenger, this help, is now going to call on very, very special white blood cells. And these white blood cells can make a specific antibody. So this is where we go from having general leukocytes, which is your general white blood cells, and we now call on your special reserves. And we now call on something called lymphocytes. So lympho, this is where your lymph glands come into place. These are special parts in your body where these special white blood cells hang out and only come into action when they're really, really needed. Okay, so this is going to be a really important sort of segue into how my lymphocytes now get called into action. So let me see if I can take you through this. So remember, we had our monocyte. They were hanging out. This was our second line of defense. Those monocytes have now changed into something called a macrophage. That means a big eating cell. That macrophage, remember, it consumed our little pathogen. And when it did that, it presented the antigen on its outer skin. This is a really important segue from my second line of defense to the third line, because now the most important thing happens in your body. This macrophage will now present the antigen to something called your helper T cell. Now, this helper T cell is a special type of lymphocyte. Okay, it's probably one of the most important in your body. This is considered this like your main general. They can now call in a really important coordinated effort to make a specific antibody. So here's the whole point of your third line of defense. This entire third line of defense is going to work together to make a specific antibody for the antigen that was presented by this bacteria or this pathogen. Okay, so if you think through, remember this was our little pathogen, and we gave it a little green spike. The only thing that's now going to stop this pathogen is if I can make an antibody specific that will fit into this lock. So this antibody is the entire job of our third line of defense. The antibody does not kill the pathogen, but what it's going to do is it's going to lock it down and it's going to prevent it from reproducing. That's the entire job. Okay, so the entire job of the third line defense is to make these really important antibodies. So let's see if we can figure out how this is going to work. Okay, so let's see if we can figure out how your body makes these antibodies. So one of the things I have in front of you, this is a series of events that your textbook gives you. It also kind of helps show this response in a slightly different way, but I'm actually going to be drawing this out a little bit sort of step by step. But this page within your notes is actually a pretty good one if you wanted to just follow along. Okay, so here's where we are in your response. My macrophage, which again, this was the link between my second and my third line of defense, has essentially presented the antigen and it's presented it to the helper T cell. The helper T cell will now make a decision, do I need to call in the cavalry? Okay, so this helper T cell is a massively important cell, and it's the coordinator cell. In different videos, it's also referred to as the dendritic cell. Okay, so this helper T cell, the first thing it's going to do is it's now going to call on something called your B cells. So you have two different type of lymphocytes. Your B cells are a certain type of cell that basically mature and grow in your bone marrow. So that's why they're called B cells. And then the second type of lymphocytes that's going to be called into action are something called your T cells. Your T cells, they grow and mature in a place called your thymus. Now, your thymus gland is a very, very special gland, and it sits essentially just over your heart. So this is something we didn't touch on. When we did the circulatory system because it's not actually attached to your blood. It's actually attached to your lymph system. So any extra fluid that needs to either go in and out of the blood to kind of make the pressure right will actually get filtered through this special system. So this is a very special filter. And so it makes sure that there's no infected cells. So the thymus gland is a really important gland within your immune sort of response. So let's see if we can figure out how to make an antibody. That's the most important part. So the B cells are really the really important thing to look at. So you have two different types of B cells. The first one is something called a plasma B cell. Probably the most important because they physically are the one who make the antibodies. Okay, so these antibodies again are going to fit specifically to this antigen. So if I have a green little spike, that antibody is going to fit over top like a lock and key. Now, what's really important you understand is these antibodies, they do not kill. Please make sure you write that down and you put an exclamation point by it. These antibodies, they don't kill. The only thing they do is that they lock down the pathogen. That's number one, and they make it so that this pathogen cannot reproduce. Okay, that's the most important thing. We want to stop this virus or this bacteria from reproducing. So it can't reproduce, and it's going to slow it down. Okay, and it's going to slow it down in order for the macrophage to come in and eat it. So remember, the only thing that can eat this pathogen are the very first white cell blood cells we talked about. It's these big monocytes and these big macrophages. They're the only ones that can eat this pathogen. So that's kind of outlined here in this textbook drawing. Your macrophage is the only thing that can kill it. Antibodies cannot kill. I'm going to say that about another 5 times. We're going to make sure you understand it. So my plasma bees are now making the antibodies. Now it's important that you understand is that this can take up to about 7 to 14 days for this to happen. So this is one of the reasons that if I were to say contract the flu virus, I might not feel well, I might spike a fever, I might get a sore throat the first few days. That's your first and second lines of defense. But when you now get into a week or two and you start to feel really tired and not well, this is your body taking all of the energy away from other parts of your systems, and they're really trying to make this solution. This is also one of the reasons that for COVID, we're asking you to basically stay put and isolate for so long because it takes such a long time to get these antibodies produced. And without them, we cannot stop the spread of these pathogens. Okay, so time is super important. Okay, the next thing that I need to do is because my body has taken all this time and energy to make these antibodies, we're going to remember them. So one of the first memories of this antibody is created by a memory B cell. So your memory B cell, it stays in the blood, and think of this as a short-term copy. Okay, so this is basically like the memory on your laptop or on the computer. It's just on the hard drive. It's okay. It's there. It's easy to access. but I could lose it. So I want to be careful. But I have a short-term memory so that if this antigen from this bacteria were to ever to show up again, my body already has a solution. So if I see this, I can now have a faster response when I have now a second exposure. Okay, so that's the whole point when we look on making these memory cells. Okay, and this is also one of the reasons that we're looking at vaccinations. Okay, because I can basically learn how to make the antibody without having to get sick in the first place. So my B cells are really important. We've created the antibodies thanks to my plasma Bs, and I now have a memory of them. Okay, but I still need to work on stopping this pathogen from creating more. So let's see if we can figure out what these T cells do. So these T cells, they're going to have a few big players. One of the first things that my T cells are going to do is it's going to help the memory banks. So one of the first thing that this group of cells will do is it will make a memory T cell. This again will stay in your thymus. So again, it's kind of a safer place to be. And this is what you can consider a long-term copy. So again, once I have this, this is like now me backing up my computer on an external hard drive. So it takes a little bit longer to get to, but I'm going to have a safer, more secure memory of, again, the antibody. Okay, so these are all keeping copies of the antibody because it took almost, again, 14 days to create this. Imagine if I can access it only after 3 days. That's the important part of having memory cells. The other thing that my T cells are going to kick off, and it's a great word, it's a great cell, these are called killer T cells. Now, a killer T cell, here's the problem with this name. It sounds like they're going to kill. They do not. Okay, so I want you to write this down right now. These do not kill the pathogen. Okay, the only thing that can kill a pathogen is a macrophage and our monocytes. What the killer T cells is that they do kill infected cells. So remember, a lot of these viruses or these pathogens, they use my healthy cells as basically factories to make more. So these killer T cells will kill my own infected cells, and it's going to prevent further replication, or it's going to prevent further copies of the pathogen from existing. Okay, and that's a super important thing because I want to be able to keep this battle basically under wraps. I don't want them to have more and more and more. Okay, so this is super important. Now, what you're also going to do is it's also going to kill healthy cells. And this is one of the reasons you don't feel well when you get an infection, is it basically is going to kill anything and everything near an infection. So it also kills the healthy cells. So I have to be able to turn this off. If I can't turn this off, I'm going to have cells killing too many other cells within my body. So that's what the third and most important cell within the T cells. This is something called a suppressor cell. So when you suppress something, you basically push down on it. A suppressor cell, this basically stops the killer T cell. Okay, it stops that, and it also stops the plasma B cells because this is going to come into play when I have the infection under wraps. So this basically it stops the immune response and it turns everyone off. And so this comes into place when the pathogen is taken care of. Okay, so when there's no longer an infection and when the pathogen is gone. And this is going to basically only happen because, again, those monocytes, remember those monocytes? They were the ones doing all of the work and eating all of these pathogens. Once they have no more pathogens to eat, they're going to send out again another chemical messenger to say, turn everything off. So this is a really important summary slide, and I only have a few words written down, but this is what I want you to be able to do, whether it's on a whiteboard, whether it's on a piece of paper, whether you're at home or in the classroom. Here's what you need to do. Can you now go through and can you talk to what are the specific roles of the following? So what's the specific role of the macrophage and the monocytes? So again, this is your second line of defense meets the third line. How does the helper T cell come into play and what's their role? And then specifically, those helper T cells, remember they are now into your lymphocytes. What is the job of a plasma B versus a memory B cell? Again, this is all around this idea of creating an antibody. So that's a bit of a big help there. Okay, and so what do these cells do in the creation of an antibody? And then what are the roles of the memory T, the killer T, and your suppressor T cells? Again, super important that you're able to put a function to these names. And sometimes drawing it out is actually a really important skill set. So here's one of the last things we're going to do, because this is a fairly important thing that's been governing our lives, and for some of you, more so than others. So here's what I want you to try and do is, again, we now have this virus called COVID-19. It's a really impressive virus, and you can sit there and complain about it, but I kind of look at it and go, wow, this thing is an amazing thing. So here's essentially a quick little review of what COVID is. I'm going to draw a COVID vaccine virus. So the really important thing about the COVID, this is your antigen. Okay, this is a certain type of virus, very different than bacteriophages, very different from the HIV virus. It's basically has a special spike protein on it that looks like a crown, and that's one of the reasons why it's a coronavirus, is it's a crown. And this is also one of the reasons why we have different variations of it. This new variation, these spikes are even stronger, and so when they land on your cells, especially in your lung tissue, they're stronger. They don't break, and so they actually can infiltrate the lung tissue even better. And so this is basically this new variation that we're starting to see. Is it's evolved. It's learning how to survive. So in a way, you have to basically be in awe of how amazing these creatures are. Okay, so here's what I want you to do. You're going to have COVID-19, and I want you to talk about what is your first line of defense with COVID? What is your second line of defense? Okay, so go through and list how are we trying to keep this virus out? And then what's your third line? So, how does your body, and this is for those of you who could be asymptomatic, you don't get sick, okay? What are the third line of defense that your body is going to do in order to produce an antibody? Okay, remember that's the whole thing. Now, the next class, and it's probably one of the most important classes, so please make sure you attend, is we're now going to talk about how this idea of a vaccine essentially gets my body to create an antibody without having to get sick. And that's a massively important thing, because for COVID, when it goes through this first and the second line, this is where, again, the side effects are massively dangerous. And we know that we have long term lung issues. Okay, we have long-term blood clotting, which is an interesting component. Okay, and we have long-term swelling, where people basically can no longer breathe. So they have swelling of essentially their respiratory lining, and people are dying of this. So we need to be really, really aware of essentially how our immune system works and the absolutely vital play and part that vaccines play, so that we can hopefully put an end to this as soon as possible. So please make sure you try and do a summary of this, and we're going to catch it the next time I see you in class.